So this is the part that's for you. We have a microphone in the center so that anybody's got questions, that way we can capture you for the live and taped feed.
So what was the question?
I was intrigued by what the specific budget pitfalls were.
The specifics of the budget issue was apparently the studio did not read the third act of the script. And when they saw the assembled movie, they decided that that wasn't the movie they wanted. Then it was a negotiation with the director to write something that the studio would be able to afford. They set a number, and I'm sure we went over by a fair amount. Shane Black has never finished a shooting day on time and on budget in his life.
Staffing and equipment rental periods.
Yeah, I mean, to shoot on a motion picture, it's like upwards of $100,000 a day.
More than that, I'm sure.
Yeah, so it's really expensive to put a crew together. And it's a couple million just to put them together, much less shooting. Editorial cost nothing. We were a drop in the bucket to the budget process. They had no problem giving us overtime and keeping 2 editors on the entire show.
One less thing, Hewlett Packard with Abbott?
No, all our systems were with the Mac, the Mac cheese graters. Yeah, all our shows were Mac OS 8.5, Avid 8.5 on Mountain Lion, I think. Or is that right? No, Mavericks.
So following up from this question, you're there. There are problems in the third act. Studio may feel differently than the director, may feel different than you do. What's your job in terms of mediating all of that? And aside from the fact that your allegiance is to the director, I'm assuming.
Yes,
at least some
absolutely.
features. What's your job in terms of facilitating communication, all of that?
A little bit of it is keeping your ducking and not getting your head shot off, because there's a lot of blame. There's a lot of well, you know, what did we do wrong? The studio ended up, and I think they admitted that they made the mistakes. They cut the budget right before they started shooting by less than $1 million, and they decided to not shoot an opening scene that was that we ended up shooting, and they decided to shoot the third act during the daytime to save money, so they wouldn't have to put lights and light up a forest. And it ended up with a scene that wasn't very exciting, wasn't very scary, because you can't make a scary movie in the daytime. So we did all the reshoots at night.
So I'm going to kind of push a little bit on that. In the room, when you're sitting there with the key people, what's the peacemaker part of you talk about keeping your head low? What's that mean to you, and what do you find yourself doing in those sorts of communication problems?
I think sometimes you have to. There are situations that call for keeping your head low. You know, sometimes you can. There are parties for whom kind of talking sense just isn't the answer, because as Harry said, sometimes it's very political. There's a lot of egos involved. There are people that, you know, have to protect whatever their turf is, and that by kind of talking sense, it's not going to be the most productive thing. So I think it's kind of on a case-by-case basis. But, you know, there is a lot of ego and power in our business, and I think you have to kind of know who you're dealing with, and sometimes being straightforward is not really the best way forward.
So here's a question that one of my students asked. I had Alan Heim come and visit one day, and that they said, you know, Norman has us do this weird thing where the first cut has to have all of the lines of the script and all the scenes in the order that it's there. Right? When do we get our cut? So, aside from the fact that that may seem odd to us, because that's what we do, what would your answer be in terms of when do you get your cut?
Harry and I have worked with people on occasion that if you don't cut the script, their belief is you don't believe in the script. So it's a very political, like almost an incendiary line to walk. You need to put all the lines in. Now, until you've earned equity and earned trust, and you've been on the show for a while and your instincts are respected and trusted, and then you have liberties. But even, if you've been on the show for a while, you have to be careful. You have to tread lightly, because sometimes it's easy to step across that line, even when you know, hey, this line doesn't really make any sense, but I think that they're going to want to hear it to let them determine on their own that this doesn't make any sense. And so you leave it in and let them arrive at it, and you go, okay, great. It was your idea. It doesn't make any sense. Knowing full well you already had the instinct that this is going to come out. But when you're working with certain personalities that are volatile and powerful, there is a sort of psychology, a delicate psychology to working with them. And I feel like as an editor, when you're in a room and you guys are collaborating together, if you kind of blow up, they react from that, because they can go, now we're really in trouble because our peacemaker is all upset. Our sort of equilibrium guy is all upset. And so now they kind of go to another level, and nothing ever gets done, and it's really difficult sometimes to pull them back to go, we still have the rest of this show to finish. And there's a lot of people with short attention spans and all sorts of things. And so, when they go off the wire, it may be difficult to pull them back into the session, So yeah, that's been my experience. It's just to kind of maintain nothing's too bad that we can't fix it, and we'll talk it through if we need a plan B.
On top of that, there's also just the very practical sense that I've sat with directors at the editor's cut screening and watched them mouth every single line in the script in sync with it coming out from the screen, because they know it that well. And if I remove something, all of a sudden they're like saying something that's not there. And it throws them, and they're gone from the movie for a minute or two.
Yeah.
Don't want that at all.
Yeah, I've experienced that. When you're working in comedy, oftentimes the talent is the EP, unlike in drama where the head writer tends to be the executive producer, showrunner, and those guys will mouth every line in there, the joke, even if it's not their joke, and you just sit back and you go, well, that's odd. You're actually like mouthing every line in it in the show. And you're right, they get thrown off, because when the rhythm of mouthing all those other lines is gone, they just stop and go, what happened there? Yeah. Where is this? Was this bad? Did we not get this? Is this a mistake? What happened? Why is it not in the movie? I was just cutting a scene the other day, and there's an overlap because we're in this world of Netflix where things are binged, and the end of one of the episodes and the beginning of the next episode is exactly the same in the writing. So I talked to the other editor that is going to do the second part of it, and he goes, how are we going to fix this? I go, well, let's figure this out. I'm probably going to end my show earlier, so you can continue on, and it'll feel like a continuous scene, but we can't really make that cut right now. Because I was listening to Steve Holfish, and he was talking about like problems and how they arise and how you kind of can't get too aggressive in your solution for them. And I told him, we have to let them see this, because what's going to happen is director A, before he comes to you, is going to go, where's the end of the movie at? Why'd you do that? And I perfectly could say, well, because it's duplication going into the second episode, but he needs to be the one to feel like he's figured that out and makes that decision, because he might actually have the plan to go, well, we're actually going to pick up the second show deeper and leave the first one alone. There is that possibility as well.
Yeah, and I'm working on an episode now where because it's a new show and they're new actors, and it's a big troupe. The director really worked with them a lot, and so I was very mindful of the things that she was trying to achieve, and I really tried to get all that stuff in the show. And I actually just looked at it before I came for the first time, and in my opinion, right now there's just like it's laggy. It's not moving. It's not and I know a lot of that stuff is going to come out, and I know that sometimes a director has an intention behind an idea, and it doesn't really translate on film. Mm-hmm. But I felt like I need to keep that stuff in because these were things that she really wanted, even though I know looking at it like, it's not going to wind up that way. But you just have to have that that patience and that and answer to your students' questions. If you're an editor, you sort of don't get your cut per se. You're serving, you're doing the best you can. You're putting your spin on the material. I feel very happy with a lot of the scenes, and I had fun doing a lot of these scenes. But it's still not written by me, not directed by me. I mean, I help to convey the sense of it. And yet at the same time, there's things that I would not do necessarily, or if I had my druthers, I would just clip a lot of stuff out, but I can't do that right now.
Yeah. So Alan's answer to that question, by the way, was every cut's my cut. Now, he didn't mean that literally in the sense that he had control over it, but he meant he's invested in every cut.
It's funny that Alan says that because I tell my assistant all the time, I go, here's the key with these changes. The key is give them their changes, but put them in your style. Mm-hmm. Because you don't want them to feel arrhythmic to how you're already cutting the show. So when I go and get these changes, oftentimes they still feel like my work, even though they're their notes. Right. That they don't really care necessarily to go by the frame, how you're executing the note. They just want the rhythm to be right and the note to be executed. And so that way I feel good about the notes as they've given me because I still feel like I'm the owner of the cut.
So I wondered, Harry, if you could speak to this. I think that one collaborator who we sort of haven't talked about at all here, and it may be an odd way to look at it, is I think the project itself, the film itself, the show itself is a collaborator. It'll tell you what it wants. It'll tell you what kind of music it wants. It'll tell you what the pacing wants to be. The actors who are in it, the way that the DP shot it and moved the camera and all of that. So could you speak a little bit about your responsiveness to the material as you get it versus what might have been the expectations that were conveyed to you by your director or your showrunner?
On The Predator, the odd thing is that I wasn't there for a table read. There was no tone meeting, which we often have in television.
And it's not a thing in features. I've never been a part of a tone meeting in features.
Yeah. So it's because it's the director that's set the tone and he's got it in his head. And this was the guy that wrote the script, so he knew everything in his head. I had difficulty in this show where I get dailies in, I look at it, I see what I think he was going for. But it's not on the script notes. There's no guidance that say, this is the best take, go from here to here. And then there's certain scenes where they've shot a lot of footage and you have no idea how this was supposed to go together. So I just guess. And I put something together that I think it's kind of in the ballpark, but I don't know.
You don't just guess.
I just guess.
You don't just
you
must have some sense of
as these
story.
guys were saying,
and-
you read the script, you follow the script, you're putting the script together. Your first duty, your first job is to deliver the script. And if there's a lot of footage that you can't quite understand, where does it go? And sometimes it's plates, sometimes it's some visual effect, sometimes the director just had a shot in his head that he decided he wanted to pick up. And so you got to wait for the director to show up and lead you through that. So sometimes the show is not very collaborative. It's you're stuck with trying to figure out what they were intending.
You mentioned like the material speaks to you as to what it wants to form itself to be, how it wants to show itself. We have a scene right now, like we had in my cut, after I got everything together, because what I couldn't gauge was the sort of emotional tracking across 4 important scenes. And scene B was shot long before scene A. Scene A is a very emotional scene that happens, and scene B, because it was shot long before, and the evolution of the shooting and sort of like the maturing of the actors and characters and getting to know their work, it no longer tracked against the more higher peaked scene. And so for that reason, it just felt boring. And the next scene after that was right on par with scene A. So I made the pitch, can we lift that scene out? And everybody kind of felt it initially because it felt like it wanted to come out. But we left it so the director could see it, and he agreed, and then he respected that we need to show it to the showrunner so she can see it. And she being super sharp, she goes, yeah, I see what you mean, that this scene doesn't have the stakes, the weight that the first scene has, and the scene 3 has behind it. So that middle scene is probably gonna have to come out. And in the notes that I got today, they kind of echoed the same thing. And that's a good case of sort of the sequence organically almost regurgitating itself and purging itself of that material, only because we had shot that scene so far in advance. It was like one of the first, I think it was the first scene that I cut. And the actors weren't really in their character skin just yet. And so it just didn't feel right. So, you know, it wasn't a battle. I didn't have to convince anyone, but the collaboration of all of that worked out really beautifully.
Can I just say that, to me, what this also speaks about in terms of collaboration is once you've been doing this for a while, having that language so that it's more than just like, I don't know, it doesn't feel right, but that an editor can actually analyze why this is, you know, that to me what you're saying makes perfect sense, that, you know, that other scene was shot when the actor was still like new, everyone's sort of getting to know things, and then the other, you know, and then just being able to like, to vocalize and to make sense, be from a story point of view, there's like, then there becomes this common language that everyone can kind of track, and you can make sense out of your argument because people are speaking about story. And that's just a skill. I think that, you know, that's a skill that you get the longer that you do it and the longer that you understand how a story is constructed and what are the things that make for a good drama, comedy, whatever it is. But I think it's really important to learn that language and learn, you know, how a story works so that you can make a pitch like that and have it make sense.
And by the way, the scene wasn't just perfectly fine on its own, on a standalone, when I cut it. It's just when I dropped it into the editor's cut that I realized it just doesn't track emotionally with what's on either side of it. And neither was it important enough for us to all consider reshooting it.
By show of hands, how many of you here are what I guess you'd call early stage editors looking to build these skills? Well, okay. What are the ways, if I could put you all on the spot, what are the ways that you would like to learn from other editors who you work with, who you collaborate with story? So come on, stand up, and then we'll get Les up there.
I tried once when I was internship in another company. So I cut a scene and hand it to the real editor and sit beside him and look at what he did, what he chose to have, what he chose not to have. And that's super, very, very good for me to learn everything. Yeah.
Well, how do you all do that? How do you teach your assistant about story?
I don't.
You don't, okay. So how do your assistants learn
I
about
tell my assistants to watch movies.
to watch movies?
Yeah. I have a whole list for one of my assistants in the movies. I call it the movies Tucker has not seen. Because there's seminal movies that are really important, that are really great, and that's the way you learn.
Okay.
I bring my assistant in the room with me a lot, and she is in the different phases. And as I'm looking at the cut myself, I will like discuss my concerns, what's working, what's not working, and why. And I also like to have her in the room when the director and the producers come in, because we're talking about story. And gradually it becomes it either becomes an osmosis process, or I will actually talk to her about certain points, just to make sure that you see, this is why we this is why we do this. This is why this scene will be good as a starting point. I'll actually sort of use it as little teaching moments, and then gradually I do like to have my assistants cut, and inevitably when they do, there's just so much to kind of so much to learn once you've actually gotten into cutting, and why you might use one performance or one shot as opposed to another. What is an arc of a scene? How do you create an arc? Why is that important? I like to teach my assistants, so that's what I do.
There you go. Well, that's a tough act to follow, James. What do you think?
It depends on the person who it is, what kind of learner they are. My assistant learns best. He has a really good knowledge of film and film history and current movies and things like that, but I feel like he learns best from hands-on. So I'll have him cut a scene for a specific reason. Either I know it's a problematic scene and I want to see how he challenges himself to not give up on the scene and get it to a place where that scene is workable for me to at least note it. And to see if he has gone through all the beats in the scene without me having talked to him about it at all, how he chooses to open a scene, how he closes a scene, where the dynamics are that the scene is shifting, how he chooses to stay on which characters for how long, how interesting it is to go to reactions versus staying on somebody for their line or whatever, and I'll have him cut that. And then I won't say anything, and then I'll take his cut and I will put it into my timeline. And we'll go over it together, because at that point, remember, he's only cutting a standalone scene. He doesn't know where I'm coming from. He doesn't know where I'm going on the next scene. So emotionally, it may track different, and just cinematically, it might not. The open of his scene that I gave him to cut may be perfectly fine. It's just that how I chose to close out the scene prior, it doesn't quite cut so well, because that's not the forwarding information I need to get me to the next scene.
Which is also a learning experience, too.
Right, because it's one thing to cut the scene as a standalone, but it's also when you see it in context to the character's arc, to where we are in the story, and now you go, okay, so let's talk about the adjustments that need to be made. And it's a funny thing that happens in the cutting room. When you're cutting, you're right there in front of it, whether you're standing and cutting or whether you're sitting. And I think there's even a difference how when you're cutting, whether you're standing, which feels a little bit more active to me than sitting. I stand as long as I can for most of my day. Then sometimes after lunch, if I'm a little bit too tired, I just kind of sit for a while and stand back up and sit back down and walk away and come back. And all these things just to keep the approach fresh. But I find myself like I have a sofa in behind me that usually the producers or the director, there's two of them. One is directly behind me. The other one is perpendicular to that. So I usually open myself up and straddle myself so I can talk to whoever the producer or director is without them looking at the back of my head. But I will have him sit on the couch because that becomes more like a viewer, and the pace is a little bit different than the guy who or the person who's cutting the scene.
Okay, so picture's locked. You guys are done editing, and you're
Doesn't
handed
it
over
feel
to
nice?
the colorist. And I missed the tone meeting. I missed the pre-production. I wasn't there for all the back and forth between the director and the producer. I'd like to hear from you. What questions should I ask to get on board quickly so I can start collaborating and get, understand the show? What
Okay.
kind of questions can I ask to get up to speed?
There's a couple of answers. One, most of the time in episodic, they don't ask me. I lock a show and it disappears. It goes to online, it goes to color. They don't involve the editor. And so there's very little communication.
But there is someone who is running the online.
Yeah, well, the DP shows up and sets the look.
At the beginning of season?
Yeah, but they go in all the way through the show and color. On a feature, again, I don't even know what the DP is intending some of the times. So we'd get scenes that were like, wow, this is the brightest scene ever, and it's a night scene. What's going on? And on this last show, we worked with Larry Fong, and he really knows what he's doing. And he did all the work with the color. All I could do is go in on a review pass and see if anything was missing. But they don't really ask me much. So I couldn't answer many questions.
What about you, James?
I think it depends on the project. You know, like Harry was saying, episodic, there's a whole group of people that you turn the code over to and they kind of take it from there. Unless there's specific notes for color that the showrunner has given in the room. And they could be related to flashbacks. They could be related to, you know, we shot a day for night scene, it's not quite working, or areas of a shot that they want to isolate and make sure we can see or whatever. And those are color notes that we pass along. And sometimes I'll, you know, it depends on the show. When I see the finished product back, because we get it back, you know, we get the color time master back and we check that to make sure it's what we hoped it would be. And I'll look at it, and sometimes, this is where you talk about people of color, sometimes I don't like the way we've been colored. And if it's a delicate thing, because if the color range and color palette, if you have a lot of different people of color, isn't quite right, you don't get all those rich differences in tones. And if the color palette is off, I worked on another show where the DP thought he asked the colorist to do this. It really wasn't the colorist's fault, but I think he thought he was doing his version of The Godfather. So everything, all the blacks were crushed.
Crimson darkness.
Yeah, everything was just super dim, and we got it back, and we were like, there's no detail. We can't really tell what's going on here. And it's just not favorable to our characters, and we need to like these characters. And the more darkly lit and underexposed that they made it look like, the less likely, the less warm we were towards these characters. So we went back in, had another session, had a different colorist. In that instance, the DP had gone on to another show, so we didn't have any pushback. It was myself and the director, and we came up with a look, and I just kind of told him, I go, I don't think this looks good. You know, so the other colorist, the new colorist came in, and she did an amazing job, and as a result of that, they went back on the other 3 shows in a series and said, those have to look like that one. Because we needed uniformity for all the shows. We couldn't have one night looking in one way and another night looking another way. So sometimes there's instances come up where, you know, the color really is editorially driven. It's really editorially impactful.
Are any of you doing color work beyond the basic LUTs inside the offline in your... so does that help to indicate to the online editor perhaps to the colorist what you're thinking of, or do you use it that way?
I mean, I like James says, in the cases of like a flashback, or there's certain, you know, there is the basic timing that's been set by the DP of the show, that's, you know, what it is. But then we have more flexibility when it comes to certain sequences that might be, you know, departures from that. And then, you know, you try to have them copy that as close as possible because, just like you were talking about with the baby crying, or was it Harry, this is something that you've worked on this. This is intentional. So yes, you definitely want to have that.
So you're playing with that in the offline to provide a communication tool in addition to all the other things you're talking about.
Yeah, because a lot of the times what you're doing is for those executives, we don't know their filter, so to speak. We don't know what they easily can see through to go, oh, here in this flashback. So I have to color it a little intentionally differently, whether it's oversaturation or higher contrast. Sometimes it's desaturation. And this doesn't mean it's going to look like that in the final color session. It's just to indicate that this is separate, this is apart. So it's clear that this is a flashback. And they understand that. And then, the DP and the director or whomever can go in there and they can actually set the look, but I have to sell it to the executives that, this is a clear event that is detached from the rest of the movie. And then there's times where, we might have time progressions and the movie kind of has an arcing color difference for either the location or the time period that we want. But it's subtle, it's very, very subtle. It's not, some of the examples that are a little different are like, I think what was it, Traffic?
Four different palettes.
Yeah, that has 4 palettes, that's probably the most acute example of that. But yeah, I think we're always doing stuff in the, because you sometimes get, even from shot to shot, there's a sort of imbalance, your cut will bump. And you go, well, it's really because this is, we were losing light and you got to kind of tweak it for, to match the performance on the other side or whatever, because it's nothing wrong with the cut. It's just that the color's off, you got to just adjust it. So I think we're all always doing
Looking for that communication.
Yeah.
But I in general, usually it's only been like a post producer that's come in and said, can you add you do some color work on this, and I really push back because I'm not a colorist. That's a specialty, and I don't know anything about it. I've tried it, and I'm not very good at it. So what I can do is, like we were saying, I'm going to be doing a pilot, it looks like, and there is real time, and then there is a series of scenes that happened 3 days ago. And one of the things I brought up to the director is that, well, how are we going to differentiate between these 2 time periods? Because it's going to be very confusing that it's the same characters in a different setting. How's the audience going to know? It could be the way you shoot it, but I could add some sort of filter or color onto that. And that's a case where you're setting the idea. It might not be, and probably won't be, the final look. Somebody else, the DP, is going to go in there and probably make more of that decision than I will, but I will set the tone, like I set the tone for the music and set the tone for the sound effects, that this is what we're going for. How you get there is up to you. You're the artist. You add your spin to it, but this is what the story is telling us that we have to do.
So let me turn that question around for a second. How would you like to be talked to get to the final result? Yeah.
I think some of the best things I've got, from students, is a lookbook where they put together, images they've culled from the internet or movies they like, or even stuff they've gone out and shot on their own, to give me examples of, tone for scenes, the arc of the whole show, and then, dealing with flashbacks or things that shift in time. I did a feature where there was actually a story within a story and then another story within the overall story. So there's 3 different stories developing, and they wanted 3 different looks, that go on for 20 minutes. And so that was a little challenging to do that. But it helped to have a long conversation with the director beforehand and just ask a lot of questions, ramping up before I even got the project, send me some ideas, and chat, and just see what I can pull from them. Because, to get to that level of collaboration and, they've been working for years, maybe if it's the writer, even long, 5, 10 years, they started writing this thing and then they shot it and finally got it edited together, and I get less than a week to put my mark on it and to get them on my side or get me on their side, so.
You get a whole week? Wow. Wow. Working on those big budget things. Okay, Eric.
Hi, my name's Eric Harnden. I'm a member or a group of 2018 ACE intern applicants, and we went to a panel recently, and one of the things I took away from it was don't just learn to learn, but learn how to be so you can be a good mentor. And I was wondering, in your past, who helped you learn how to collaborate? Did you have a good mentor, and what was your experience with that?
For me, hopefully everybody that I work with, I learn something from. That's kind of the fun of it, even if it's a little bit or a lot. It just depends on, who it is. But specifically, I was taught by a guy, I had an internship when I first got out of college, or while I was in college rather, who thought that I would be a good editor. I was, interning, and I started in Atlanta, and then Georgia's a right-to-work state, and the TV station that I was working at, they actually was a paid internship. They required their interns to do everything. So he saw some of my early cutting, and he was like, I think you'd be good at this. And he really started showing me all kinds of editing techniques, and I learned a lot from him, and that's where I kind of fell in love with editing. And so he's responsible. And then our peers. I look at everybody's work as well, and I look at movies, and I look at different types of movies to see how the storytelling unfolds, to get ideas about it. I looked at Mad Max Fury Road, because I thought that, Margaret Cecil did an excellent job with no visual redundancy in that. That is a hard picture, because there's so many stretches without dialogue in it, to have all that action linear and clear and clean and speak to you without being repetitive, where it's just gratuitous action. So for every different genre that there is, I just look at our peers' work. I mean, because there's amazing editors. So at this point, I'm not looking for a singular mentor, but I'm just learning the craft, continuing to learn the craft from my peers as well, and from putting in time myself.
Yeah, I think one of the key things is really just trying to be a sponge and trying to take advantage of every situation you're in and learn something from it. I mean, for me, and this was not a formal mentoring situation, but when I did start to work for Stephen Bochco, when he was an experienced writer, and so Stephen would always say the editing room is the final rewrite. So he would come into the editing, and that's one of the great things about being an editor as opposed to being like a crew member. The DPs, the production designers, they don't work directly, at least in the television world, in that continual way with the creator. So anyway, he would be in the room with me. David Milch would be in the room with me. The directors would be, and they would just be talking. And they'd be talking about and they were very critical about their own work. So this doesn't work, that doesn't work. We don't need that scene. And they would, in the process, they were talking that language that I was talking about before, like about arc and about, emotion and what the tone of the scene was as opposed to what the dialogue was. And they were just talking all the time, and I was just listening, and it wasn't like they were specifically trying to teach me, but I was so fortunate to be in the room with these guys who were at the top of their game, and inevitably, I absorbed a lot of that information, and as James said, in every situation, and that's the fun of it, you can really learn new things, and if you have fun learning that stuff, then that's why you love the job, and so it's a continual learning process, but just really be open-minded to any opportunity you can.
Harry, you have a mentor you want to talk about? Or process?
I gained the most from working with a couple of writers. It wasn't editor. I had one experience with an Academy Award winning editor, and he was a miserable person, and I got nothing out of it. I got really nothing. But
So this is now for our audience on Facebook Live to figure out who you're talking about.
he's dead. Rest in peace.
No connection, right? Died suddenly.
Nothing to do with it. And I wasn't there. No, but the people I think I've learned the most from, Craig Silverstein was the executive producer of an episodic show called Turn: Washington Spies. And I've never worked with a person that was so smart about how he could tell the story he wanted to tell by taking out the pieces that we didn't need. Inevitably, or it just worked out that these shows would always be 15, 20 minutes over the time period that we were allowed. So that's a lot of stuff you got to get rid of. And Craig was just fantastic he didn't write all the shows, but he was part of the writing team, and he knew what was important. He knew where the series was going, 2 and 3 years ahead of us. So he was really great at learning, oh wow, we could take this whole chunk out and not miss it, and it's still telling the best version of the story. And Shane Black was like that as well, where he's got an incredible memory. He remembers every line of dialogue, I think, from every script he's ever written. Because he'd add lines of dialogue from The Last Boy Scout into current movie. And we would take certain scenes that were critical to setting up the story. There was one scene that was in a psychiatrist interview, and we must have redone that 40 times. And pull stuff out, add stuff back in, rearrange it. It was a real incredible learning experience, how malleable this material was to tell different versions of this story and tell it in different ways. So it's writers, to me, that have been, I've absorbed the most from.
It seems we keep kind of going back to the psychological nature of what we do and the storytelling nature of what we do, which I think is probably a good distillation of what we do in the editing room. If I could sort of roundabout give my own answer to Eric's question, and get up on my soapbox just a little bit, is I think that, Farrel, what you said about having your interns or assistants in the room with you absorbing like a sponge is really important. And that's really hard nowadays as an intern, where that you're often invited not to be in the room, you're there. And my feeling is that if you are offered an internship and you're not offered that sort of access, then you're being completely exploited. And I think that for your movement up, we always know we'll never get another job again. We just know that, right? We always know we have to take everything that's offered to us, because otherwise who knows what's gonna happen. That's not ultimately true. I think some of the power's in saying no at every step along the way, if it's appropriate to say no. So demanding the internships where you actually get a chance to observe decision-making. It's like what I did as an apprentice editor, standing next to Barry Malkin or Alan Heim and watching them talk with their directors. That was probably the most valuable internship that I ever had. Yes.
All right, the process that you use to be sure when you review the online, do you put 2 timelines up and compare? How do you know that nothing was left out? And when you collaborated with the co-editor, you said you both
The answer to the first question is good assistants will get a CTM back from the online. They'll put it over top of your cut and add some split screens. There's a way to make an X and give you a split screen and go over every cut and every shot and make sure that it's accurate. What I was referring to is we did a final review at PhotoChem where the DP, me, the other editor, and the assistant and some other people watched the movie all the way through, make sure that there was no problems. I found they had missed a visual effect, which they added back in. And the second question, each of us in 2 different parts of the world were getting dailies, pretty much at the same time. We would take those dailies, cut them, and at the end of the day, he'd send me his sequence, I'd send him my sequence. We would look at the other person's work, and when it came time to deliver a editor's cut to the director, he said, don't worry, I'll put together the best version of our cut. And he very graciously, shockingly graciously, used about 80%, 90% of my cut to assemble the show. And ultimately, it didn't make any difference because the director had very strong ideas about what he wanted. So then we totally recut it. So,
And how did you work after that?
Huh?
How did you work after that?
After that, it was kind of interesting. It was convenient and comfortable for the director. I set up an editing room where I sat at the back of the room. We had kind of a big room with a monitor at the far end. We had a couch. Director sat in front of me to the right, and Billy sat on the couch to the left. And we would go every cut, and Billy would make a suggestion. Shane would make a suggestion. I would try whatever they asked me to do. So basically, I was driving, and they were talking about all the ideas. Shane would say, I want to do this, and Billy would say, I don't think you need this shot. So it was a long but really interesting process of putting a movie together.
Would you do it that way again?
Never.
With the same, never. Sounds among the more difficult choices to make, yes. Right, that sounds interesting.
It was, well, see, the advantage was Billy had very different ideas of what was important, what wasn't. And there would be certain character beats that drove him nuts. And like we had 2 characters, they would just exchange short snippets of dialogue that had nothing to do with anything. But Shane Black is a person that likes dialogue and characters interacting, you know, snappy guy talk. And Billy kept wanting to cut it out. And Shane said, no, I don't want to. We'd cut it out and said, no, put it back in. Okay. So we tried everything. Any suggestion anybody had, we tried it. And then ultimately, like Farrel was saying, there'd be certain scenes that I wasn't happy with. Everybody else was happy with. I would go in at the end of the day and do my cut of that particular scene, put it in a bin, and when the time was right, I would say, hey guys, can I show you a different take on this scene? And I was about 50%. 50%, they, you know, half the time they said, Shane said, yeah, that's better, let's use that. Half the time he said, nope, I don't like that.
Co-editing is really interesting, I think. And I mean that interesting, as well as interesting in both ways.
No.
So it ranges over I mean, Marianne and Mary Beth on all the stuff they did with JJ, each would take scenes as they came in dailies, and those would be their scenes forever.
Forever, yeah.
They
I never
would not
understood,
intercut. And that's the only time I've ever heard that working. But they made it work. And other people just break it down by reels. And other people kind of intentionally work on each other's scenes. There's just so many ways to do it. because of the collaboration is really what's important.
But if you, what was great about Billy's idea was that if you both cut the entire movie, you both know the entire movie, and you don't have this proprietary, that's my scene or that's his scene. You're all in it together, and to me, that's a better way of working.
Interesting, it's great.
I recently went on an interview where they wanted every editor to cut anything, everything. Just, you're cutting the whole, every scene that comes in. There was no, this show is not yours, this act is not yours. You just cut. And that was their way, the producer's way of trying to suggest that you'll know the whole series that way. I've never worked that way. I was uncomfortable working that way, so I knew that the job wasn't for me. I need my own show.
So it sounds like a very expensive way to work, too.
Chaotic, and politically volatile,
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem efficient to me.
Right.
But, who's to argue, that's
worked,
what
it
they're
worked.
accustomed to, so they should have those editors who want to work that way.
So there is an editor-director team who I know who the editors told me that they have a deal that if they have a disagreement about something, or if the editor has a version of a scene and tries it out and shows it to the director, the director says, no, I don't think so. Don't really, so that he can put it away and bring it out again in X number of weeks or months or whatever. Shows it again. If the answer is still no, puts it away, and he can bring it out one more time. And it has to be appropriate for the time they do that. And if it gets shot down 3 times, then that goes away forever. That's the deal that they've worked out together in order to have the most fruitful collaboration that allows for change in the film, but doesn't strain the relationship. They just work that out ahead of time. So clarity, communication, I think, is really key here. So do we have any more questions before we wrap it up? Sure, come on.
2 things. I heard mention of the reframing of shots, and I remember last year's panel, one of the editors mentioned that she had cut a scene and it never entered her mind to reframe the shots, and then the producer came in or whoever and just blew a gasket. And then once she was guided to do that, she went back and reframed shots and did all the stuff that she traditionally had thought the DP shot it the way he wanted it to be visualized. So I'm curious, as our technologies have evolved to where we can punch in and all this stuff that we can do in post now, how much collaboration do you get from DPs and stuff on those kinds of notes? Because it seems like it's getting to be more and more commonplace, and I wonder how that gets articulated. And the second one would be, when I was in film school and we did the traditional Gunsmoke reel with the scene and whatever.
So sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it was wonderful. But I remember our teacher had said that a traditional film editor for that show would be given about a week, and he said the big fight scene you might take a day and a half on. I'm curious what time frames in the episodic you're given to work with, like how many days and so forth and stuff like that, because that will affect collaboration too, because all I live in is shorter, faster, funnier. And the only tone meeting I've ever had involved bars, and it was for 1 minute in front of the show, 60 seconds before the program started.
Okay.
Farrel, you want to take
Well, for example, on Nashville, we shot 6K, I think it was. And because the DP said, I specifically am giving you this because I know that there's going to be times when you're going to need close-ups, and have at it. And I actually do take liberties. I feel like there's a lot of times when, obviously, there's shots that seem very composed and very specific, but the other thing about shooting episodic is that they often are running and gunning, and they don't have time to frame those perfect shots. And so I do take liberties. And on the other hand, if someone says that no, this was supposed to be that way, okay, I would back off. But I make use of that tool a lot.
Yeah. Has that changed as the technology has advanced for you? Because I grew up in online linear editing. You can't blow it up that much without getting bad. Now in this day,
Oh, definitely, yeah.
I get frustrated that even in the feature world, this last show they shot with Arri Alexas, and it wasn't 2K, they call it 3.2K,
Right.
because they were shooting the full, with
Raster.
the full raster. I don't really care what the DP thinks. I need to frame the shot that tells the story the best. So I'm combining shots that aren't meant to go together. Now, my exception is I've done a lot of large format movies. Started in 65 millimeter film, 3D. And the last one was, I think, shot on Sony F65s, which can shoot 8K. On those, that's all about the image. And it's not for me to reframe that, because unless there's a technical reason, there's C-stand in the shot or some problem, those shows I will respect the DP more than any other show. But everything else, I don't care what they think. If they didn't get the shot, I gotta make a shot. You know, I need a close-up of this, and I got to get rid of everybody else in the frame, and I'm blowing it up as big as I know, and I'll test it and make sure that it doesn't look bad. I don't want it to look bad, but I'm there to tell the better story.
So the second part of that question was what your schedules tend to be. And I know that may change as you move through the season, and it's certainly different Netflixy than it is when you are providing every week. But what would you say on a typical network, a free TV show? What's your schedule generally?
Typically, we get 4 days, 3 days to turn a cut around.
For editor's cut.
For editor's cut, but you know, it gets into this tricky area with some co-producers where they're so schedule driven and their loyalties are more with the show and the studio, and they put things down on paper and they don't check with you, because every show has its own complexities and differences. And if you're cutting one show at a time, okay, that's one thing to have 3 or 4 days to turn the cut around. If you have multiple shows, you have daily still coming in and you're trying to finish another one, and you might need an extra day. Or, you know, if the show has a lot of visual effects or whatever it is, it's just a different kind of show that requires more time and attention to it, you might need an extra day to ask them to push it. But I worked on shows where they tell you have 4 days, but then the 4th day includes the last day of you getting daily. So it's really not, it's a deceptive 4 days. It's really 3 days that you're getting, you know?
It's tight.
Yeah, you don't have a lot of time. The idea of keeping up the camera, you might not be able to do that, but you certainly can't fall too far behind.
Yeah. And on a Netflix kind of schedule where you're delivering everything, I know that really backs you up. Well, on the back end, because all the foreigns and everything have to be basically delivered simultaneously, and all episodes together. So does that cut into your schedule? Do you find that they're built out properly so it doesn't affect your schedule? Or
there's so many hot things that come up during shooting. And the show that I'm on right now, we're block shooting. So I will at one point have 3 shows open, and in various stages. And it's always impacting the dailies coming in, and
right.
We're pushing that show back, and the producers may need an extra day or so. They know that I need the time, so it's not really a big battle. And they know where there's cushion, they being the co-producer, who's very, supportive of her editorial staff. She knows where she can make slides in the schedule and adjust to what the new circumstance is. Because if a producer comes in and goes, look, we have more notes than we got back that we need to address, and this is not one day's notes, then what are you going to do? You're not going to, you got to do the notes, and the notes take what they take. It's not about rushing through them and doing a half-assed job. You need to do the notes well so that you don't get notes about they feel rushed along. So if you need more time, and usually they give you that. But I find that in the episodic world, they're pretty much more stringent about that. Opening up the schedule to allow you to have the time it takes to do your job.
But it's a little, I mean, this is my first Netflix show, but as opposed to episodic where they're sort of discrete, you finish one show, you're done, you start the next. There's, you know, I thought, oh great, I have like 7-8 days for my editor's cut. Well, really what happens is that, you know, once I start my next show, I'll be in my editor's cut, but I will also be getting notes from producers, and I'll also be getting notes from so you're really, you know, like James says, you're actually, it's not a full day of being able to edit. So it's in a way more intense.
So the other skill you're talking about is juggling.
Yes.
I have to be a good juggler. Well, I think that actually is a good place to wrap it up. So I want to thank all three of you, Farrel, James, and Harry. Thank you for taking your Friday evening to spend with us. Much, much appreciated. Same for you. I hope you learned some things. And I'll see you the next time, okay? Thanks very much.